to understand this deeper meaning of poetry. But you avoid poetry because it is unapproachable and esoteric. Sit back and relax. Our next speaker hopes to make poetry a bit easier for you. Please welcome Mary Sari, giving her speech, Good Poems, Bad Poems.
Ninth grade English, 23 15-year-olds, and I among them. Mrs. Bell began our poetry unit. Thus, good poems have a deeper meaning. Bad poems do not. What? We disagreed with that immediately. What about Casey at the Bat? I think that's a really good poem. And The Cremation of Sam McGee, it's my favorite. Or Paul Revere's Ride. None of those have a deeper meaning, do they? Those are popular poems, not good poems. Good poems have a deeper meaning. Well, we didn't agree with that right off the bat, and Randy, the class redhead, stood up and raised his hand. Mrs. Bell, I think that a good poem is one that I can read, I understand it, and I like it. I think a bad poem is one that I can't read through, I don't understand it when I'm done, and I don't like it. The lesson had begun. One of the poems we read was Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. I wept when I read Ozymandias, but it wasn't because it was such a beautiful poem. I cried because it was so hard to understand, because it was obtuse, obscure, and it was painful to read it. I was used to getting A's on my paper, but I drew a blank when I had to write what this poem means to me. The deeper meaning of Ozymandias boils down to this. Despots die and turn to dust, as we all do. Well, why couldn't Shelley just come out and say that? Why did he have to make it so hard? Fellow Toastmasters, poetry doesn't have to be deep, dark, and murky. And I want to share with you a few tips that I've learned through years of trying to read poetry and trying to enjoy it that actually have worked for me. And I'd like to follow Randy the Redhead's 3 criteria for good poetry. I can read it, I can understand it, and by golly, I like it. First of all, reading poetry. Poetry must be read slowly. You can't read poetry fast. There is no such thing as speed reading in poetry. The poet has selected each word very carefully, and you need to go through it in order to get the meaning and the beauty of the poem. Second, poems need to be read out loud. They sound different when you speak a poem. The images come to life, the words spring off the page, and it just sounds different. And you'll hear a different story and see images that you didn't see when you read it to yourself off the page. There was a time in history when people read poems to each other for entertainment, just before movies and TVs. Perhaps a number of our parents did that. Read it slowly, and then read it out loud. As a matter of fact, I'd like to read a poem out loud to you right now. I discovered Billy Collins this weekend. Has anyone heard of Billy Collins, the poet? He was poet laureate for 2 years. I hadn't heard of him either until very recently, but Billy Collins also teaches poetry. His poem, Introduction to Poetry. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hide. I say, Drop a mouse into the poem and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside a poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Which gets me to understanding the poem. 2006 for me was a year of understanding poetry. I bought one of those poem-a-day calendars so I could read a fresh, new, and mercifully short poem every day. It worked well. I learned a lot, and in September there came a poem my way that I just didn't get. So I turned to my literary consultant, my friend Carol. She's an English major. Carol can suss meaning out of anything. I wrote her an email and asked her to give me the deeper meaning of this poem, which I will read to you right now. I Pick Up a Hitchhiker by Jay Leeming. After a few miles, he tells me that my car has no engine. I pull over. We both get out and look under the hood. He's right. We don't say anything more about it all the way to California. Carol, what does this mean? She writes back. Well, it can be as simple as a dream poem. But since people always want these things to be more meaningful, my guess, and that's all it is that his car engine represents his spiritual center. There being nothing there, he just ignores it and goes on. The body will run, and hopefully no one else will point out what's missing. And when he gets to California, it won't matter, because nobody there has one either. Or she says, I may be bullshitting. Your friend Carol. Well, now I have Carol, my literary consultant, and I have a poet laureate of the United States saying, cool it. There's not always a deep, dark meaning to a poem that you have to suss out, that you have to research. Sometimes it's good just to let a poem happen to you and think about it and enjoy it, which is the third criteria. Did you enjoy the poem? Sometimes that takes a while. I didn't like Hitchhiker when I first read it, but it's 8 years later. I still pull out that poem when I think about poetry. It's just something about the image it gave me of a long road going through Nevada on the way to California, and you don't say a darn thing so that the car will keep running and you get there. The meanings can be whatever you want to make it. Doesn't have to be deep. Not every poem is an Ozymandias or Ode on a Grecian Urn. So are there good poems and bad poems? Shakespeare had something to say about that. There is nothing neither good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Mr. Toastmaster.